What if I told you that the greatest form of power is not in your voice, but in your silence? That the less you say, the more they fear you. In a world that screams for attention, the one who remains quiet rules. Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling crushed, even though you said everything you meant to? That tight knot in your throat, that unsettling sense of weakness, these aren't just emotional residues, they're signs that something deeper was lost in translation. We are conditioned to equate speaking with strength and silence with surrender. But what if that equation is flawed? This feeling stems from a societal script. Speak to be heard, argue to assert value, win to survive. It's a mental reflex born out of fear, not necessarily of being wrong, but of not being seen. Silence then becomes synonymous with invisibility, and invisibility is mistaken for irrelevance. This illusion is precisely what Nietzsche sought to destroy. For Nietzsche, silence wasn't a vacuum, but a force. He saw it not as the absence of voice, but as the presence of restraint, of internal power. The knot you feel isn't weakness. It's the clash between your social programming and your authentic self, which instinctively knows that real strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply walks away, calm, unshaken, superior. Society often resembles a noisy theater, where those who shout the loudest get the spotlight. In this space, volume is mistaken for authority, interruption for intelligence, and dominance for leadership. People who speak calmly, who choose silence over noise, are quickly labeled as passive or weak. Nietzsche, however, exposes this charade. What masquerades as confidence is often nothing more than inflated ego, trying to assert itself before it crumbles. He warns that those who need to constantly express, argue, and dominate are not displaying power, they're hiding fear. Their loudness is armor, not evidence of strength. In contrast, silence becomes a test. Those who can endure not being the center of attention, who don't need to interrupt or overpower, embody a kind of self-assurance that the noisy can't even comprehend. True power lies in restraint. It's not in making your voice heard at all costs, but in knowing when not to speak at all. In Nietzsche's world, the theater of arrogance collapses when silence walks onto the stage, not to perform, but simply to exist. And in that moment, the audience doesn't applaud the loudest actor. They wonder why the quiet one disturbs them the most. We've been taught to believe that engaging in debates, defending our opinions, and proving our points is a sign of intelligence. Yet, Nietzsche saw this as a deeply flawed paradigm. The moment you feel the need to explain yourself, you've already entered the opponent's arena, and by their rules. Most arguments aren't about truth, they're about power. They're psychological jousts where egos clash, and the goal is not understanding, but validation. The louder the argument, the deeper the insecurity. You don't argue because you know you're right. You argue because you're afraid of being seen as wrong. Nietzsche's philosophy challenges our fundamental assumptions about communication. For him, silence isn't passive, it's strategic. He recognized that words often dilute truth, that the compulsion to speak comes not from strength, but from fear. The strongest are those who can stay still amid chaos. Silence in this view is not a void, but a weapon. It creates discomfort, forces others to fill the space, reveals their desperation to be validated. When you don't react, you strip others of their control. You force them to confront themselves without distraction, without deflection. Nietzsche's idea of power is internal. It is not imposed through domination or debate, but radiates through presence. Silence is that presence in its rawest form, undeniable, unshakable. It speaks not to convince, but to unsettle. It doesn't echo, it resonates. To be silent, in Nietzsche's sense, is to command without command. It is to resist the pull of ego, to master your instincts, and to know that truth does not need volume. It needs clarity. And clarity often comes in stillness.
Silence disturbs people far more than speech ever could. When someone says nothing, the human mind rushes to fill in the blanks. Is it judgment? Is it disinterest? Is it knowledge? This ambiguity creates a psychological imbalance, and Nietzsche saw this imbalance as power. People fear silence because it takes away their script. Most know how to respond to words, but they don't know how to face a void. That void becomes a mirror, and what it reflects is often unbearable. It reveals insecurities, exposes egos, and shatters illusions. Nietzsche teaches that this is not accidental, it's strategic. The silent individual doesn't just withhold sound, they project presence. While others fumble to reclaim control of the conversation, the silent one already owns the space. And when they finally speak, every word is a bullet. So, if you want to know who holds power in a room, don't look at who speaks the most. Look at who speaks the least, yet is most feared. That's Nietzsche's warrior, armed not with noise, but with knowing. In a world that celebrates constant expression, silence is often misunderstood as a sign of weakness. Many have grown up believing that to remain quiet in the face of confrontation is to concede. But Nietzsche challenges this idea, insisting that silence can be the most powerful response, if it comes from mastery rather than fear. Submission is when silence is born from guilt, insecurity, or conditioning. But there is another kind of silence, one born from conscious choice, from a refusal to participate in games designed to trap the ego. True silence is not passive, it is resistance in its purest form. Nietzsche warned that the world will mistake strength for weakness when that strength is silent. But the mistake is not yours to correct. Power does not explain itself. It doesn't chase recognition. The one who holds the most control is often the one who feels no need to demonstrate it. So the next time you remain silent, ask yourself why. If it's fear, examine it. But if it's strategy, own it. Because silence, when intentional, is not submission. It's supremacy.
The reactive mind is the slave of the moment. It jumps to defend, justify, argue, not out of strength, but from compulsion. Nietzsche believed that as long as you're reactive, you're not in control. You're being pulled by strings you didn't even know existed. Reactivity is a sign of emotional vulnerability. It's your ego trying to patch its cracks with urgency and noise. But the one who observes rather than reacts becomes the most dangerous person in the room. They don't play the game, they watch others expose themselves while they remain still. To react is to reveal. Every word uttered in anger, every explanation given in haste is a clue to your weaknesses. Nietzsche's ideal human is not one who wins arguments, but one who no longer needs them. They've transcended the chaos that governs ordinary minds. Train yourself not to react. In moments of tension, pause, observe. Let others unravel while you remain anchored. The reactive mind screams. The powerful mind listens and decides if it even needs to respond.
Nietzsche coined the term herd morality to describe the collective mindset driven by the need to be accepted, validated, and approved. It is a morality of the masses, designed not to empower the individual, but to contain them. If you constantly worry about what others think, you are still inside that prison. Herd morality rewards conformity and punishes self-determination. It teaches you to be agreeable, to avoid conflict, to blend in. But Nietzsche urged us to rebel against this moral cage. The moment you stop needing to be liked is the moment you start becoming free. When you choose silence over justification, you are refusing to submit to that approval system. You are saying, I exist without your permission. And that, in Nietzsche's philosophy, is the first true act of power. Freedom does not begin when others accept you. It begins when you no longer care whether they do. Herd morality is loud because it needs consensus. The individual, the true individual, walks in silence and in sovereignty.
When you listen without the intent to respond, something extraordinary happens. The person in front of you reveals themselves completely. Nietzsche believed that by mastering observation, you gain access to the hidden vulnerabilities of others. Silence becomes your scalpel. Most people speak to hide, not to reveal. They use words as armor, as distraction. But when faced with silence, they begin to unravel. The absence of reaction becomes unbearable. They over-explain, they contradict themselves. They expose what they tried so hard to conceal. Nietzsche saw this not as manipulation, but as insight. Observation is not passive, it's a form of dominance. While others try to shape your perception with noise, you gather data, store information, prepare precision. And when you speak, if you speak, it's devastatingly accurate. You don't need to interrupt. You don't need to correct. All you need is patience. Because in the silence you hold, their truth is revealed not to you, but to themselves. And that's where real transformation or collapse begins. There's a kind of silence that doesn't disappear into the background. It fills the room. It is the silence of presence, of internal gravity, of someone who doesn't need to speak to be seen. Nietzsche understood that this type of silence carries more weight than any speech ever could. When someone walks into a room and everyone feels it, that's not charisma, it's authority. And it's often silent. It doesn't beg for attention, it commands it through composure, stillness, and clarity. Others react not because you impose, but because you're immovable. This presence is built through discipline, through detachment from validation, through mastery of emotion. You don't gain it by talking, you gain it by knowing, by being so anchored in your truth that words become optional. Nietzsche's version of power wasn't loud, it was sovereign. And the most sovereign thing a person can do is remain silent, while the world around them tries to shake their foundation in vain. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, or overman, is the embodiment of the human who transcends ordinary morality and psychological dependence. This figure does not react. He does not explain. He does not justify. His mere presence redefines the environment around him, and often he does this without uttering a single word. The Übermensch is not interested in being understood. He is not concerned with fitting in.
His silence is not emptiness. It is full of intent, mastery, and self-control. While others compete to be heard, he stands above the noise, watching, calculating, choosing his moment, if it ever comes. This figure is feared because he cannot be manipulated. Guilt, shame, and the need for validation have no power over him. His silence becomes an armor that reflects all attempts at control. In a world obsessed with reactions, the one who does not react becomes untouchable. To walk the path of the Übermensch is not to speak louder, but to speak less, and only when the silence has already done the work. True dominance, Nietzsche reminds us, is not in volume, it is in presence.
When someone expects your reaction and you give none, it creates a psychological collapse. Their mental rhythm is broken. Nietzsche understood this well. Humans are wired to anticipate, to prepare their next move based on your reply. Silence disrupts this game entirely. In the absence of your reaction, the other person's mind begins to spin. Insecurity creeps in. Doubt takes root. They begin to question themselves. Did I say something wrong? Are they judging me? Do they know something I don't? The silence becomes a psychological mirror, and few like what they see. Nietzsche would argue that in such moments, silence isn't passive, it's the active dismantling of ego structures. You don't need to attack. The other person self-destructs under the weight of their own projections. Their fear, not your words, becomes the weapon. So when you're silent and others begin to falter, it's not coincidence, it's the power of your absence. A vacuum they can't fill, a mirror they can't avoid. And Nietzsche knew that true control is often exerted by saying nothing at all. Many speak not to communicate, but to perform. Words become theater, smiles become masks, and yet, when met with silence, that performance begins to fail. Nietzsche saw silence as a blade. It cuts away pretense, revealing the raw self behind the illusion. Most people don't know who they are without their story. When you don't respond, they can't continue playing their role. They begin to unravel because the script no longer makes sense. Your silence becomes the void in which they meet their unfiltered self. Nietzsche believed truth is often unbearable for the average person. That's why they surround themselves with noise. But when faced with a silent mirror, your calm, grounded presence, they either evolve or collapse. There is no third option. To speak is to create distraction. To remain silent is to let reality surface. And when that happens, the truth doesn't need to be spoken. It reveals itself violently, beautifully, undeniably. There is a strategic brilliance in saying less. Nietzsche understood that words like energy must be conserved. Every unnecessary sentence is a potential weakness exposed. The more you speak, the more you risk. But when you hold your words, you build tension, and tension is power. Speaking becomes a conscious act, not a reflex. Like a warrior who draws his sword only when the strike is lethal, the silent thinker waits, observes, stores energy, and when the moment comes, his words are precise, devastating, irrefutable. This economy of energy is not laziness, it's discipline. It's the refusal to dilute one's presence with chatter. Every silence builds pressure. Every word spoken after that silence lands like a hammer, because it wasn't expected, it was earned. Nietzsche's wisdom lies in this restraint. True power doesn't perform, it prepares. And when it finally acts, it doesn't shout. it ends the conversation with one sentence and the weight of 1,000 unsaid thoughts behind it.
There is a silence that waits, not out of fear, but out of strategy. Nietzsche understood this silence as a form of sharpening the blade in the dark. It is the quiet that precedes precision. The silence of someone who doesn't attack impulsively, but surgically, when it counts. This is the silence of the disciplined, the mentally prepared. It carries weight because it signals control. While others react, the one who remains still gathers data, stores emotion, calculates the perfect moment. And when the moment arrives, their strike is not loud, but it is final. Nietzsche believed that mastering this kind of restraint separates the impulsive from the powerful. It's not about being passive, it's about being lethal through precision. The ones who remain calm in chaos often hold the deadliest strength. You don't win by shouting. You win by knowing exactly when to speak and knowing that one sentence, one look, one moment of presence can dismantle what noise never could. Not all silence is strength. Nietzsche warns that silence can also be submission dressed as serenity. Sometimes we stay quiet not because we've mastered ourselves, but because we've lost control entirely. This is the silence that doesn't prepare, it surrenders. It's the kind of silence that comes from feeling small, ignored, or unworthy. A silence rooted in trauma, in patterns of avoiding conflict at all costs. It becomes a cage, and the longer we stay inside, the more we confuse it with peace. But Nietzsche pushes us to look deeper. This silence, though it may feel protective, is often the voice of a wounded ego hiding from the world. It's not strategy, it's resignation. And it must be broken if we are to rise. Real power requires honesty. Ask yourself, is your silence an act of strength or a symptom of fear? Because the first transforms you. The second devours you from the inside out. When you remain silent in the face of manipulation, you may think you're keeping the peace, but you're likely building someone else's empire. Nietzsche saw this clearly. Those who do not assert themselves become tools for those who do. Manipulators thrive on the silent compliance of others. They exploit calmness, twist understanding into weakness, and step into power vacuums left by those too afraid to speak. And while they rise, you shrink, slowly, quietly, invisibly. This kind of silence is not noble. It's dangerous. It trains others to ignore your boundaries, to take your space, to make your silence a stepping stone for their dominance. Nietzsche would call this the morality of the slave, a system that rewards obedience and punishes authenticity. To stop being used, your silence must evolve. It must shift from avoidance to assertion, from submission to sovereignty. Because silence, when misused, doesn't protect, it enslaves. Nietzsche's philosophy is not about encouraging silence for silence's sake. It's about transforming its meaning. The silence of submission must die, and in its place a new silence must be born, one that commands, not conceals, one that declares, even without words. This new silence is forged through inner clarity. It's the silence of someone who no longer seeks permission to exist, who has burned the scripts handed down by society and replaced them with a truth forged in solitude and strength. This silence is not fragile, it is final. Presence is the key.
You don't have to speak to prove yourself, but you must be. You must radiate the kind of stillness that says, I know who I am. I owe no one an explanation. Nietzsche believed that the individual who reaches this level is no longer part of the herd. They have risen above it. The silence of submission obeys. The silence of presence reigns. And once you've made that shift, the world no longer shapes you. You shape it with every step, every look, every silent breath.
Nietzsche didn't write for those content with survival. He wrote for those who wanted transcendence. And the final form of silence, the one he revered, is not a reaction or a tactic. It is a way of being. It is the silence of the one who no longer needs the world's applause. The silence is not about power over others. It is about mastery over oneself. It is the stillness of the warrior who knows the battle is already won, because it was never about the enemy, but about his own discipline, vision, and truth. To reach this level, you must burn the need to be understood. You must let go of the craving for validation. You must become a force, not of noise, but of meaning. Every gesture, every glance, every silence becomes a statement. I am whole. I am untouchable. This is the final evolution, the individual who walks quietly but shifts everything. The one who no longer reacts, but reshapes reality simply by existing. That is Nietzsche's ultimate human. And if you're ready, your silence can become that, too.